This is breaking news.
We continue our breaking news coverage. Just 10 days before his return to the Oval Office, President-elect Donald Trump has been sentenced this morning in his criminal hush money trial. Welcome. I'm Mary Calvi.
And I'm Chris Raggi. Trump appeared virtually at this morning's sentencing. We're getting our first images of his appearance in court, where Judge Juan Merchan handed down an unconditional discharge, meaning Trump will not face any jail time, no fines or probation, but will remain a convicted felon.
Now, the judge is saying that never before has the court been presented with such a unique set of circumstances. He called this a truly extraordinary case and saying really the trial itself was no more special or unique than any others that have come before the courts. But of course, this one was very different. It was back in May. A jury convicted him on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to a payment made to Stormy Daniels before the 2016 presidential election. The payment was to keep her quiet about a sexual encounter she says she had with him, which he denies. You know,
also Donald J. Trump making this one comment during the sentencing a few moments ago, saying that he will obviously exercise his appellate rights. That's Todd Blanche and Donald Trump also. Donald mentioning that the fact that I am totally innocent, I did nothing wrong. That was one of the comments made during this morning's sentencing hearing. And Judge Merchan, at the end of this sentencing, wished him Godspeed as he now assumes his second term in office. But it was very interesting, obviously, to see the president-elect and his attorney, Todd Blanche, appearing via Zoom during this proceeding. And we heard a few moments ago that all the prosecution attorneys and the rest of the court stenographer, all the regulars that were there for this case were all back in the jury, back in the courtroom for this. We've got team coverage for you this morning in Lower Manhattan, and we've got some experts, of course, to break down exactly the political implications that go along with this sentencing.
Let's begin by going outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where Alice Gaynor has just come outside. Alice, you were in the courtroom when all of this happened.
That's right. It was a pretty brief proceeding. We weren't sure how long this was going to go because President-elect Trump was allowed to speak at his sentencing, but he did seem to keep his remarks within a certain amount of time. He, of course, was virtual. We saw him on the monitor sitting side by side with his defense attorney, Todd Blanche. They had American flags behind them. Before the proceeding began, I had a view of the monitor from my seat, and I could see them laughing, joking around, appearing to be jovial, so it didn't appear to be a super stressful situation at the moment. Once the video screen was broadcast throughout the gallery, we had a full courtroom of journalists. We also had an overflow room. On that monitor, you could see the feed of the president-elect, his attorney. You could see the defense table. You could see prosecution table, and you could also see the judge, and that is what the president-elect and his attorney were also seeing on that monitor feed. So the judge began. Judge Juan Merchan, he was the trial judge. He said, "Let's impose sentence, please." First, prosecutors spoke. They said that they also recommended a sentence of unconditional discharge. And again, this all is because of the office that the president-elect is about to assume. It was interesting. Prosecutors said that he was found guilty, falsified 34 separate entries with the intent to defraud to promote his own election. When the prosecutor said that, you could see President-elect Trump on the screen shaking his head no. At other times, his arms were crossed. He was looking down. He appeared to be taking notes, maybe passing notes to his attorney, Todd Blanche. It was interesting. Prosecutors also pointed out that the president-elect was far from expressing remorse throughout all of this. They said his conduct before and after this trial merits consideration with this sentence. They said that the defendant has engaged in a coordinated campaign to undermine its legitimacy, this whole court proceeding they were talking about here. They pointed out that he allegedly, voiced these attacks on the court, on family members of people of the court, the jury, and the justice system as a whole. They pointed out he was held in contempt 10 times during this trial and also held in contempt in other courts. They say he attacks the rule of law itself. Despite all this, again, they were recommending the unconditional discharge sentence, which is what the judge carefully considered and came up with himself. Then, after prosecutors were done, that was defense attorney Todd Blanche's moment, and he said this was a sad day. He said the president-elect and his family, they were very upset about all of this. He said, "We certainly understand where we are today, and they intend on pursuing an appeal of the verdict and what happened." They also said the only sentence that should be imposed, if one was to be imposed, was unconditional discharge. So everyone was in agreement here. Then President-elect Trump himself started speaking, and in the gallery to listen to him was Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. He had no visible reaction because Trump was mentioning him by name. And again, Trump repeated a lot of the things he said during trial when he would go into the courtroom and speak to the cameras during breaks, during the trial, during the lunch break. He said, you know, he did nothing wrong. He again said this was a legal expense in the books where everyone could see them. He says they were put down by accountants. He's expressed surprise, again, saying he doesn't know why he was indicted because it was a legal expense that he reimbursed to his personal attorney at the time. He was reading a lot of things from a paper in front of him. He again repeated his claims that it was a political witch hunt to damage his reputation. He was talking about the votes he got. While he was speaking, Judge Juan Merchan was carefully staring at the monitor, no visible expression from him as well. President-elect Trump was talking about the gag order he was under. He said, quote, "I'm totally innocent. I did nothing wrong." He said he was treated very unfairly, called this an embarrassment to New York. Then it was the judge's chance. So right before he imposed this sentence officially, he explained he wanted to make sure that the defendant, President-elect Trump, understood why this sentence was being imposed. The judge said never before has this court been presented with such a unique and remarkable set of circumstances. Quote, he called it a truly extraordinary case. But he noted once those doors closed during the trial, this case proceeded, this trial, just like any of the other cases that were going on at 100 Center Street at Manhattan Criminal Court as well. He said this trial was no more special, unique, or different than those other trials. This all went according to the rules and the procedure. It was all guided by law. So then he imposed that sentence of an unconditional discharge. He also wished the president, he said, Godspeed as you assume your second term in office. Chris and Mary.
All right, Alice, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Joining in the conversation now is CBS News New York political reporter Marcia Kramer and professor at Hofstra Law James Sample. Welcome to the both of you. Marcia, we will start with you. This was a state, not a federal case, as we've talked about. Mr. Trump, though, argued, though, he was entitled to full immunity from the sentencing, that he's president-elect. This is surely a legal first, but explain some of the reasons why the court disagreed.
Well, the court disagreed because this was a state case and not a federal case. And he felt that this was something that should be handled on the state level. But I think what the important question you have to ask is what happens now? And there's three things I'd like to talk to you about. First of all, this clears the way for the president-elect to file an appeal, a formal appeal of his charges. The problem that he faces is that he has to go through New York state courts. So that means he goes first to the appellate division, first department, and then if he doesn't succeed there, to the state court of appeals. Both are controlled by liberal Democrats, so it could be tough going. There's no way to know how that happens.
We get in the hallway.
The thing I'd like to tell you is that because it's a state case, as president, he can't pardon himself because he can only pardon in federal cases. So if the courts uphold this conviction, he can't do anything about it. And the last point I'd like to make is whether he decides to go after Alvin Bragg. He said it was a political witch hunt to damage his reputation. And he had said during the trial that he was very, very critical of Alvin Bragg. Now, there's several ways that he could go after him. One is politically. Alvin Bragg is up for re-election this year, and he could certainly either run a Republican against him or get a Democrat to run against him. And the other possibility is that he could have his Justice Department, Todd Branch being named the #2 person, he could have his Justice Department start to investigate Alvin Bragg. So a number of interesting questions as the case moves forward.
Let's get to Professor Sample. You know, Trump could have faced 4 years in prison and a fine of up to $5,000 for each charge. This is an unconditional discharge, a slap on the wrist. What's considered typical in a case like this, Professor?
Well, Mary, it's a good question, and there is nothing typical about the circumstances of this case and this defendant, of course, except, to Judge Merchan's point, what transpired inside the courtroom. As Alice reported on Judge Merchan's commentary, once you were inside the courtroom, once those doors closed, this was an evidentiary matter. It was about the facts in a place that Donald Trump calls home. So there are certainly instances in which unconditional discharges are the sentence. Normally, those are for very, very minor incidents or where you're talking about essentially somebody who is geriatric or facing potentially, where there's no consequence and no value to be gained by imposing a sentence of incarceration or a fine or anything like that. This, however, is a vindication of the prosecution, and it's a respect expecting of the 12 individual jurors who heard mountains and mountains of evidence for 6 weeks. And as you and Chris reported on, along with Marcia, throughout that process, they heard the evidence and they came to the unanimous conclusion that he was guilty of the crimes charged.
Marcia, Trump had asked the Supreme Court at the 11th hour to step in and decline or at least postpone the sentencing. What did last night's 5-4 ruling tell you about how the court is going to proceed moving forward? Because I think a lot of people were surprised that the court
Well,
did.
you know, it shows that the court showed some independence. You know, in the past, the court has stood with him in terms of other of their rulings saying that he was, you know, with the immunity issue. But I think that you have to take a look at who the votes came from. One was Chief Judge John Roberts, and the other was a Trump appointee, Amy Coney Barrett. So it shows that they have independence and they're not going to be a rubber stamp for Mr. Trump as he tries to take other cases to the Supreme Court. And also, you know, there are other things that presidents appeal in the Supreme Court. So you have to wonder whether they want to get out from the idea that it's a rubber stamp. But of course, of the other four votes, 3 were appointed by then President Trump.
And Professor Sample, now that Mr. Trump officially has a felony conviction, does that complicate anything he'll be able to do while in office?
I don't think it does. I think that the practical consequences of this are symbolic. There's nothing that he won't be able to do as president that he would have otherwise been able to do. And to clarify one thing, it's not just the fact that this is a state case that is the reason that the immunity did not apply. It's also that there were no official acts involved, no official presidential acts involved. There's nothing officially presidential about falsifying business records to hide and to prevent disclosure of an affair with an adult film star. So the immunity ruling from July didn't apply, not only because this is a state case, but because there's nothing about that is official in nature about concealing that affair.
And Marcia, with Trump about to begin his second term, how do you think political players in New York will fare? I know you mentioned it in regard to Alvin Bragg and any others.
Well, I think that the message of the election of President Trump's being elected was that people in New York care about a lot of the things he talked about, border security and the economy. And so I think that what you're going to see politically in New York is a lot of people who are running for office who might have been more progressive and more to the left will try to run more to the center to deal with the issues that Trump brought up that appeal to people in New York. And I think it will affect all kinds of elections, including the mayoral election, which is coming up. And you have to ask yourself this question. So Trump, during his speech today, called it a political witch hunt to damage his reputation. The question then becomes, does he now feel more sympathetic to Mayor Adams, and would he consider a pardon for Mayor Adams, either a pre-pardon before he goes to trial, or a pardon if he were to be convicted?
The relationship has warmed over the past few months.
It has
indeed. To say the least. All right, Marcia, James Sample, thank you very much. Marcia, thank you for your insight here.
This has been special breaking news coverage. I'm Mary Calvi.
And I'm Chris Rangi. We'll have continuing coverage and a breakdown of what happens next coming up on CBS News New York at noon. For updates anytime, go to cbsnewyork.com.
This has been breaking news.